Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. Another one of our Safer at Home series. Another rare afternoon one, but I want to thank you all for participating. Before we get started today, as you know, all our talks are brought to you the courtesy of Cape Cod 5, Martha's Vineyard Saves, our Citizens Federal Credit Union, and all the books on our series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope you visit the locals. And I'm really thrilled to have somebody coming from West Sussex, England. So it's not the top of the afternoon for our speaker, but really happy to have him. Simon Parkin is a British author and journalist, contributing writer for The New Yorker, for The Guardian, for The Observer. Simon, I believe this is your second book. Would you welcome our guest today, Simon Parkin?
Hi, everyone. Hello. Well, I'm just going to head straight into it. I'm here to talk to you about my book, A Game of Birds and Wolves, which recently came out in the US in paperback, and to really just give you an overview of the story and what gripped me about it, and will hopefully interest you as well. When I was a child, my brother and I spent our summer holidays at our grandparents' house in Devon, in the southwest corner of Britain. They loved board games and had an old wooden chest that was filled with them. And one day, in among the boxes of Scrabble, Monopoly, and Bagatelle, we found a copy of Battleships, which I'm sure many of you will know and remember. But this wasn't the plastic tabletop version with which we're all familiar, but rather a luxurious version of the game that was played out on a giant map that you had to unfurl and spread across the floor. We'd take turns to throw the dice and maneuver our ships into opposing positions. And then at the press of a button on a tiny little destroyer, a small plastic puck would fire along the glossy board. And if your aim was true, the disc would slip into a hole at the base of your target. And then through some toy maker's magic, the top of the ship would fire into the air like a cap rocketing from a shaken bottle of lemonade. My grandfather never spoke much about the war. I knew that he had been a merchant seaman, but not when or where he had sailed, or even if he had seen combat at sea. And as such, I never put together why he might own this particular game, or why he would often watch us from the doorway while we played. A couple of years ago, I started working on a radio documentary for The New Yorker on wargaming. Now, wargaming is a tool used by politicians, civil servants, and the military to explore via the medium of dice and play the potential effects of real-world events. Throughout the recent years, for example, the British government has used wargames to envision the potential effects of a second referendum on Brexit, forcing civil servants to role-play as various politicians in the drama. During the making of that radio program, I visited the Defence Academy in Shrivenham, and there I met a man named Major Tom Muat. Major Tom is essentially Her Majesty's game designer-in-chief, a kind of Dungeons and Dragons moderator dressed in khaki and fatigues. He's designed and run war games everywhere from the Pentagon to Beijing. I asked Tom if he had an example of where something learned in the crucible of a war game had gone on to be of use in the real world. And he explained that the hotline that links the White House to the Kremlin, which is often represented in films as a red telephone, was an idea that came out of war games played during the Cold War. Then he mentioned a little-known story about a retired naval captain called Gilbert Roberts, and a group of young women who invented a war game that radically changed the course of the Second World War. In the last week of 1941, Britain had come perilously close to defeat. The UK is obviously an island nation and reliant on imported goods for its resources. And at that time, no less than 95% of Britain's fuel came into the country from trading partners and colonies, while 70% of its food supply was imported. In total, in fact, an average of 68 million tons of food and fuel was delivered by a 3,000-strong merchant shipping fleet. The sailors of these ships knew from the bitter experience of the First World War that the safest way to cross the Atlantic Ocean to collect the food and the fuel that was needed in Britain was to move in convoys, finding safety in numbers. So they gathered together in groups, sometimes consisting of more than 60 vessels, as you can see here, a photograph and an example, and they sailed together in tight formation. The Royal Navy would then send warships to protect this flock of ships. And the Royal Navy ships were known as escorts, and they would encircle the convoy as it plodded its heavy laden course across the Atlantic, exactly like sheepdogs protecting a herd of sheep, ready to fend off any attacks. Even before the outbreak of the Second World War, Admiral Karl Denitz, leader of the U-boat army of the German Navy, reasoned that if his fleet of submarines could block and sink these convoys, then Britain, as an island, would be unable to sustain its people without the imports and would starve. In this way, hunger, the blunt, persistent weapon of war, could be deployed against Germany's enemy from a position of remove. Denitz had long believed that the most effective way to attack the British ships was to organize his U-boats into packs, a bit like wolves hunting sheep. It was a tactic he had, in fact, tentatively explored as captain of a U-boat himself in the First World War, just before he was captured by the British and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Sheffield. Incidentally, he managed to earn a prison transfer to a lunatic asylum shortly after he was imprisoned, when he pretended to be a U-boat, convincing his captors that he had lost his mind. The Rudel Tactic, or wolf pack tactic, was borrowed from the wolves of childhood fairy tales. Wolves, Denitz knew, hunt cooperatively, and by working as a pack, they can bewilder and run down prey that would otherwise be much too large to tackle alone. Togetherness also affords the animals the ability to care for wounded pack members without sacrificing momentum. What better way, Denitz reasoned, for the U-boats to hunt, not as loners picking off stragglers, but as an organized pack, touring the sea with shared focus and intent, able to take down far stronger foes than they might otherwise. The belief that if Britain's supply lines were broken, then British defeat would soon follow was not limited to the Germans. Prime Minister Winston Churchill described merchant shipping as at once the stranglehold and the sole foundation of Britain's war strategy. This fundamental truth was acknowledged in a chart that took up almost the entirety of one wall in the operations room at the Admiralty, the Navy's London headquarters. This graph charted the number of ships that had been sunk at sea by the U-boats and showed in the starkest terms imaginable the stakes that were at play. The top quarter of the graph was divided by a thin red line that marked the narrow threshold between victory and defeat. If the rate of ships sinking stayed below the line, then the British people could survive on the amount of food that was making it through. But if the graph exceeded the red line, the country could no longer continue to participate in the war. While Denitz was not given anywhere close to the 300 U-boats that he estimated via his own war games that he needed to blockade Britain, the embryonic wolfpack attacks that began towards the end of 1940 immediately showed their effectiveness. In British shops, fish became scarce and expensive. Butter, bacon, and sugar could only be bought with coupons. Onions, which prior to the war were imported from Spain, France, and the Channel Islands, vanished from greengrocers, as did lemons and bananas. The frequency and success of the U-boat attacks steadily climbed, and by the end of 1940, the U-boats had sunk more than 1,200 ships, about 5 years' worth of construction in typical peacetime conditions, and more than the rest of the German Navy and Luftwaffe combined. The numbers told, if not the whole story of the Battle of the Atlantic, then the salient point. The British were losing catastrophically. Someone had to figure out what was making the U-boats so effective and what, if anything, could be done to upturn that success. Gilbert Roberts was a 41-year-old naval commander who had been discharged from the Navy in 1938 following a bout of tuberculosis. After he recovered from illness, Roberts found himself a young retiree with neither a ship nor a purpose. He joined the Home Guard for a stint and then worked as a police officer in a Devon constabulary. Neither of these roles suited Roberts, who was a talented tactician and wargamer. He was a heroic man, in fact, even before the arrival of war and its inevitable provocations towards courage. Once, while reading a book on a Cornish cliffside, Roberts spied a group of walkers as they struggled to climb from the mouth of a cave against the rushing of the tide. Roberts tripped down the cliff, jumped into the water, and for more than an hour fought the waves to recover one of the sightseers. In the early months of war, Roberts was further tested by circumstance. One night during the Blitz, while he was sheltering in the basement of his South London accommodation, Roberts heard a thud on the ground above. He climbed the stairs to peek through the window, and there, in the white light of an overhead flare, saw a bent, oily German bomb, half buried in the pavement with its fuse still sparking. Roberts ran towards the danger, snatched out the fuse, and burned his fingers in the process. In the last week of 1941, Roberts received an unexpected summon to the Admiralty headquarters. He was told to bring an overnight bag. There he met two of the Navy's most senior officers, one of whom was an aide to Winston Churchill. They described the true extent of Britain's ongoing losses in the Atlantic. That Britain had come so close to starvation had been deliberately kept from the British public. Churchill would routinely exaggerate the number of U-boats that had been sunk in public speeches, and he would downplay the number of British convoy ships that have been sunk as well. For example, at Mansion House on the 20th of January 1940, at a moment when the British forces had sunk just 9 German U-boats, Churchill claimed to have sunk half the U-boat fleet. To arrive at this conclusion, he had added 16 U-boats the Admiralty believed may have been sunk to the 9 that were known to have been sunk, and for good measure added in a further 10 of his own imagining. As such, when Roberts was told the awful truth of the situation, he was astonished. He was then informed that because of his achievements in running war games during his time in the Navy, he had been chosen to figure out the success of the secret to the U-boat's success in the Atlantic. Roberts' task was threefold. He was to discover the secret of how the U-boats were operating. Then he was to develop effective countermeasures. And finally, he was to teach these tactics, whatever they might be, to any and every captain sailing the Atlantic between Britain and the north coast of America. Tuberculosis may have robbed him of the chance to serve at sea, but it had, in this unlikely way, provided him with an opportunity by which he could make his presence felt on every destroyer and every corvette on the ocean. Before he left the Admiralty to catch the midnight train to Liverpool, Roberts was led into an office where he came face to face with Churchill, who barked, "Find out what is happening and sink the U-boats." Roberts arrived in Liverpool to a beleaguered city. Hitler would later admit that he had targeted Liverpool with his bombers because he believed it housed the headquarters from which the Battle of the Atlantic was being orchestrated. His guess was correct. In fact, Derby House, which was home to this command centre, had already been hit successfully by German incendiaries, although the bombers wouldn't have known it. When Roberts arrived, he was informed that he was to be given 8 rooms on the top floor of the building. He could move in just as soon as the roof had been repaired. Roberts' first meeting with the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Percy Noble, was a complete disaster. After dismissively asking what precisely Roberts planned to do with his games, Noble told him, "Well, you can carry on, but don't bother me with it. I'm busy." The next question was who precisely was going to assist Roberts in his work to expose the secret of the U-boat tactics. By 1942, most men who were able to serve in the Navy had already been enlisted and deployed. The Navy, in its desperation to find workers, turned to young women. advertising posts in the Wrens with the slogan, "Join the Wrens and free a man for the fleet," the Wrens being the name for the Women's Royal Naval Service. The Wrens' motto at the time was "Never at sea," a pledge that also carries with it a sort of negative space assurance. We know our place. What other organisation has ever been defined by what its members are forbidden from doing rather than what they hope to achieve? Nevertheless, under the stewardship of Vera Lawton Matthews, a former activist for the suffragettes, Wrens were gradually deployed to all manner of interesting and essential roles. Some became welders, others became carpenters, some loaded torpedoes onto submarines, and many plotted progress of live sea battles on maps hung in operation rooms, just like the giant plot at Derby House. The Wrens' heroism often matched that of the men they had freed for duty. In 1942, for example, Pamela McGeorge was asked to deliver an important dispatch from one side of Plymouth to the commander-in-chief at the other. She drove her motorcycle through the night while German planes dropped bombs on the city. When one of these bombs landed close to the road, McGeorge was blown off her bike. Its wheels were mangled beyond repair. But undeterred, she continued on foot to Admiralty House with the letter in her hand. When she arrived, she offered to immediately head out again with the response. At Derby House, Roberts was introduced to 10 young Wrens, some of whom had only recently left school, who were to be his supporting team. They had been handpicked for their aptitude in mathematics and statistics. The first and most senior woman assigned to the team, who you can see here, was Jean Laidlaw, an assiduous 21-year-old who was obsessed with ships and sailing and who later became one of Britain's first female chartered accountants. Then there was Laura Janet Howes, who had come to England from Antigua just 4 years earlier. Howes was a mathematical wunderkind. At school, when her teachers were off sick, Howes would often teach the class maths in her stead. Elizabeth Drake was next. Drake's father, Charles, worked as an actuary for the Prudential Insurance Company. Drake was chosen to work with Roberts based on the assumption that an aptitude for mathematics, like height or temper, runs in the family. The last of the Wren officers was a sportswoman, Nancy Wales. Nan, as she was known to her friends, was older than the others at 27. She was a formidable tennis player and competed in badminton at the county level. But hockey was her true passion. 2 years later, she would play for the county of Lancashire and then earn the unique distinction of being the only player to go on to play for their arch rivals Yorkshire, a team that she captained for many years. The unit, which became known as the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, was given the top floor of Derby House. As Roberts' dismal first meeting with his superior Percy Noble had demonstrated, the unit was viewed with tremendous scepticism by many senior officers who wondered what on earth these people were doing playing games when there was a war on. As such, Roberts and his team of Wrens worked quietly in their top floor home, trying not to attract too much attention until they had something concrete to bring to their superiors. Watu's office resembled something between a school gymnasium and, thanks to the scattered sticks of chalk and string laying around, a child's playroom. The linoleum floor was divided into sections, as you can see here, like a giant chessboard. Each line is spaced 10 inches apart, which represents 1 nautical mile. And the counters on the floor represent ships and surfaced German U-boats. Around the edges of the room, as you can see just here in the corner, stand great sheets of white canvas. They're arranged into enclosures, a bit like voting booths, except each one had a peephole cut into it at eye level. The average visibility from the bridge of a warship is 5 miles. And the canvas sheets were positioned in such a way that when a player peeks through the slit, he or she can see the equivalent of a 5-mile view of the tiny ships here on the floor. Linen side wires can be bent to adjust visibility depending on the game scenario that was being played, and they held the apertures open. So one team positioned behind canvas sheets sheets were played as the escort captains. Those were the Royal Navy ships that circled the convoy, trying to protect them like sheepdogs around a flock. And the other team, which was usually captained by Roberts or his right-hand woman, Jean Laidlaw, played as the U-boats. As in the real Battle of the Atlantic, each side's objective was focused on the convoy, and the escorts had to protect them while the U-boats had to attack them. And each side also had a secondary objective. For the escort ships, this was to sink as many U-boats as possible, while for the U-boats, the aim was to avoid detection and to exit the battlefield unharmed. The convoy ships, that's the ships carrying the food and the supplies from North America to Britain, which is the prize in play for both sides, would automatically move forward at each turn of the game towards their destination while the battle raged around them, just like it did at sea. Players were given 2-minute intervals in which to submit their orders for the next turn to replicate the urgency of the real battlefield. The movements of the U-boats were drawn in green chalk on the floor, the colour which was chosen as it was impossible to make out against the brown of the floor's tint when viewed from behind these canvas booths. This ensured that the U-boat positions were undetectable to the players peering through the canvas screens. The escort ship's movements would be added to the floor in white chalk. You can see some of the markings here, which are legible to those standing behind the canvas holes. Turn by turn, the pieces move around the floor as the escort ships dash to the site of an explosion to drop their depth charges, while the U-boats perform their feints and dodges in an effort to pick off more convoy ships while evading the escort. The Wrens acted like something like umpires measuring distances and marking movements in chalk to ensure that the game played out as accurately as possible. And then finally, at the end of the game, everyone would come together, sit around the board, and which was now crisscrossed with markings, and Roberts would reveal how everyone had fared. The game was a simplification of real U-boat warfare, of course, but there was enough here to begin staging recent sea battles. And the objective was to experience the action from the perspective of the U-boats, and by sort of reverse engineering what they had done in the battles, assess what the British might have done differently to save ships, supplies, and lives. With the rudiments of the game in place, Roberts now spent a great deal of his time studying the after-action reports, which had been written by naval officers, writing up battles with U-boats and surviving them in search of a clue to the tactics. Roberts' position at Derby House meant he was ideally situated to meet and quiz any and every naval officer who passed through Western Approach's command. Roberts didn't have to rely solely on the rather staid written testimony of sailors. He could also listen to first-hand accounts by interviewing men as soon as they returned from sea. During the course of several interviews, a rather chaotic picture emerged. Not only was there no universal set of tactics with which to fight the U-boats, neither was there any training on how escort ships should work together as a team. The destroyers and the corvettes, it seemed to Roberts, were broadly free to do whatever they wanted according to the captain's individual whim or notion. Fred Osborne, who was first lieutenant of the corvette HMS Gentian and who later worked at Watteau for a number of months, for example, described convoy defence as difficult and haphazard in the absence of any collective countermeasures. No clear doctrine for combating attacks on convoys had been formulated and taught, he wrote, and as such, the losses were appalling. Roberts asked every escort captain he interviewed the same question. What do you do when one of your merchant ships is torpedoed? Some spoke vaguely of going to action stations, others about increasing their speed, but when pressed, most shrugged in resignation. What could you do, blind in the night, explosions sounding all around, when your radar operator was unable to distinguish the sound of a U-boat in the water from the noise of a choppy sea or even a shoal of fish? There was another reason why the naval escorts were having such an awful time hunting U-boats, and this was an incorrect assumption about the way in which the U-boats were attacking that had resulted in thousands of deaths at sea. Roberts and the Wrens didn't know it yet, but their task in turning around Allied fortunes at sea would rest on successfully spotting this cardinal error in the British understanding of how the U-boats operated. To understand this hidden secret tactic, we have to first meet this man, 28-year-old Otto Kretschmer. He's there sitting in the middle, drinking his beer, who is perhaps the most famous of Germany's U-boat aces. The young U-boat commander was taciturn and focused. One of his nicknames was Silent Otto, but he did inspire utter loyalty from his crew, many of whom were young men barely out of school. Kretschmer's contribution to U-boat strategy was profound. In the early months of the war, U-boat captains would attack Allied ships from outside the boundary of a convoy. This was basically to abide by the recommendation of the manufacturers of their torpedoes, which advised captains to ensure a distance of no less than 1 kilometer between a U-boat and its target. There was also uncertainty about the British effectiveness of sonar, which was known at the time as ASDIC, and this led many U-boats to fire their torpedoes really only from well outside the detection range of the escorts, at a range of 3,000 meters or even more. Now, Kretschmer wanted to see what would happen if he could slip past the naval escort ships, enter right into the lanes of the convoy, and fire basically from point-blank range. His motto was one ship, one torpedo, and the less distance between his torpedo and its target, the easier it would be to adhere to. Kretschmer first attempted the maneuver in September 1940. One night he slunk in between the escort ships in the cover of darkness on the surface of water, thereby evading detection by the Allied sonar. Like a fox inside a henhouse, he then successfully sank 3 ships in rapid succession, firing his torpedoes at point-blank range. When he returned to the U-boat base in the captured French port of Lorient later that month, Kretschmer wrote up his findings in a set of standing orders for his crew. The document laid out the rules for the efficient and successful running of a U-boat, a 12-point plan that covered everything from the need for an effective lookout to the importance that men bother to clean their dishes every day. Most of the instructions were common sense. Point 9, however, went against the written advice that U-boat captains maintain this minimum distance of 1,000 meters between the U-boat and its target. Kretschmer wrote plainly that at every given opportunity, torpedoes should be fired at extreme close range. This can only be done, he wrote, by penetrating the escort's anti-submarine screen and getting inside the convoy lanes. This, he added, should be the objective of all our attacks. In 2 sentences, Kretschmer had outlined a tactic that would, in the months to come, lead to the deaths of thousands of Allied sailors and raise the line on that chart of shipping losses at the Admiralty in London perilously close to the threshold of defeat. Back in Liverpool, one of Watoo's first tasks was to restage a battle from a few weeks earlier in December 1941, in which British ships had successfully hunted 3 U-boats, which was a unusually high success rate. Roberts and his team believed that the battle for convoy HG-76, held the secrets that they were searching for. The team arranged 48 ships in 12 columns. They then added the tracks of the 3 U-boats who were known to have participated in the battle, U-434, 574, and 131, onto the floor. Now, with the stage set, Roberts began to move the convoy, which spread across the 6 lines on the floor to represent 6-mile width, in 2-minute intervals at a simulated rate of 10 knots. Each move was made in precisely the same pattern as the actual escort had made at sea a few weeks earlier. Blow by blow, Roberts imitated the action as per the official reports. Seeing the battle from a crow's nest perspective above the board, a question formed in his mind. If the U-boats were firing from outside the perimeter of the convoy, as was widely believed, how had HMS Anavor, which was in the center of the convoy, been sunk? Might it be possible, he wondered, that the U-boat had attacked the ship from inside the columns of the convoy? There was, he reasoned, a simple way to prove his theory. Hold everything, he told his staff, as he rushed into his office to make a phone call. Roberts picked up the receiver and asked the operator to put him through to the Flag Officer of Submarines in London, hoping to speak to its Chief of Staff, an old friend of his. To Roberts' astonishment, the Flag Officer himself, Admiral Sir Max Horton, you can see here with the cigarette, picked up the phone. Horton was an officer of foreboding distinction. As a young submarine commander, he had scored the first naval kill of the First World War. And on return to port, he would signal his success by cheering onlookers by flying the pirates' flag, the Jolly Roger, a tradition that would continue thereafter until the end of the Falklands War. Horton's talent as a submariner had propelled him up the ranks, and years later his biographer described him as the greatest authority on submarine warfare. Now, on the phone, Roberts explained who he was and asked Horton if he might be permitted to ask a question. During the last war, Roberts asked, would you ever have crept among the ships of a convoy to fire your torpedoes? Of course, replied Horton. It's the only way of pressing home an attack. Thank you, sir, said Roberts, and hung up the phone. It was late, but Roberts asked Laidlaw, one of the younger wrens, Janet O'Kell, to stay behind with him to reset the plot and run a new game on the board. The two women were infused with Roberts' excitement, agreed, and they hurriedly reset the game. Now this time, Roberts placed the U-boat models in the center of the columns of the convoy, and then ran the events of the battle in reverse. If the range of the torpedoes was around 2.5 miles, it was reasonable to imagine that the U-boat captains would fire from less than half of that distance to maximize their chances of scoring a hit. Between them, Roberts and the Wrens began to plot different scenarios that might have enabled the U-boat to sneak into the convoy without being detected. Only one of these checked out. The U-boat must have entered the columns of the convoy from astern, and it must have done so on the surface of the water, where it was able to travel slightly faster than its prey. And by approaching from this direction, where the lookouts rarely bothered to check, the U-boat would have been able to slip inside the convoy undetected, fire at close range, and then submerge in order to get away safely. Roberts and the Wrens headed to the kitchen to make coffee and a round of corned beef sandwiches. The conversation then continued to centre on the battle they had left on the floor of the game room. The group discussed how if they were a U-boat captain, having made one of these point-blank range attacks, how they might then escape unharmed. The game had enabled the fledgling tacticians to begin to think like U-boat captains, and from that perspective, the answer suddenly seemed obvious. Having made your attack, you would of course dive, and then you would sit and simply wait for the convoy to roll on overhead. Eventually, Roberts concluded, I would emerge deep from the stern of the convoy. With Kretschmer's U-boat tactic abruptly unveiled, Roberts now wanted to try out some potential countermeasures that might foil the plan. The team returned to the game room, and Roberts assumed the role of the U-boat captain while Laidlaw and O'Kell played as the escort ships. A countermeasure revealed itself immediately. Rather than splay out from the convoy at speed and start to drop depth charges at random, as was common practice, Laidlaw and O'Kell lined the escort ships up around the convoy. And while the convoy continued on its way, each escort began to perform a triangular sweep, listening for U-boats on the Aztec. They immediately picked up the positions of the attackers and were able to rush to them and drop their depth charges. With a mounting sense of excitement, the team ran the procedure twice more, and in both instances, Roberts' U-boat was detected and sunk. It was by now the early hours of the morning. In all the excitement, time had passed unnoticed. Roberts ordered a staff car to return the two women home. The next morning, Roberts invited Admiral Percy Noble to come up to the top floor of Derby House and watch a demonstration of their findings. Noble entered the game room flanked by his own staff. The commander-in-chief warily eyed the chalk markings on the floor, the canvas sheets decked out like ship portholes. What was all this make-believe nonsense? Undeterred, Roberts began to explain the team's discoveries, how the U-boats would slip between the convoy ships on the surface of the water at night when they were unlikely to be spotted, how they would make their attacks and then dive to wait until danger had passed. The atmosphere was frosty. Noble had made no secret of his condescending skepticism toward Watu and its work. Roberts detected a tone in Noble's manner of snootiness, as he described it. How could this former naval officer, with his nubs of chalk and jumbles of string, contribute anything to the battles being waged at sea? But as the game played out on the floor, the Admiral began to sit forward in his chair in astonishment. One of the Wrens, playing as a U-boat, fired a torpedo from within the convoy's columns and then dived. Roberts performed the team's newly developed counter-tactic, moving the escort ships in triangular sweeping patterns designed to flush out the hidden U-boat. While performing the sweeps, one of the escort ships picked up the Germans' position on the radar. As he watched, Noble saw for the first time the cardinal errors that had been responsible for such tremendous loss of life at sea. And when the demonstration was finished, the Admiral stood to his feet, congratulated Roberts, and asked what the maneuver was to be called. Jean Laidlaw, a 21-year-old woman, the 21-year-old responsible for statistical analysis, explained that she had christened it Raspberry. It was, she said, a razz of contempt aimed at Hitler and his U-boat fleet. The commander-in-chief then turned to one of his men and told him to take down a message to be sent out immediately to the Prime Minister. The first investigations have shown a cardinal error in U-boat tactics, it read. A new, immediate and concerted counterattack will be signalled to the fleet within 24 hours. And this here is one of the first drawings of Raspberry ever made. Raspberry was a revolutionary tactic, and its effect on the war at sea was immediate. Shortly after the demonstration to Noble, Watu began running week-long courses who would play imaginary battles and learn how to perform the counter-tactics, which soon included a variety of other operations, mostly named after different fruits. For the officers playing as escort commanders behind the canvas peepholes, the games were intense. The pressure of the 2-minute intervals mimicked the stress of action against U-boats at sea, and each officer would often become caught up in the fiction, no longer viewing the chalk lines and the wooden models as game pieces, but as real ships, real wakes and explosions. The game occupied an unusual position between reality and make-believe. No limbs or lives were lost here on the linoleum ocean, but neither was the game fully abstracted in the way that Monopoly is, for example, based on but distinct from the property business. For the men who played Watu's games, who had often returned from sea just a few days earlier and who were often due to sail again a few days later, the game had an unsettling quality. The choices made here on the floor reflected an officer's current thinking. If then his ship was lost in the game, then he had to cope with the knowledge that had the same situation arisen out at sea and he behaved in the same way, he may well have died. Make your mistakes here and you won't make them at sea, Roberts was fond of saying, a euphemistic way of pointing out the scale risk against which the game was attempting to insure its players. For all Roberts' engaging presentation, a man who failed to drive off a U-boat, or worse, who lost his ship in the game, would leave Watu feeling sternly chastened. We destroy U-boats out in the oceans, wrote one observer who sat in on a round of the game, but the death sentence is delivered miles away in the Assize Court in that old building on the banks of the River Mersey. Each course, which lasted from Monday to Saturday and which ran weekly without interruption from the first week of February 1942 to the last week of July 1945, involved up to 50 officers at once. It consisted of 4 game scenarios, which each varied details such as weather conditions, visibility, the time of day, and the size, speed, and start point of the convoy. And finally, when the game was finished, the officers would step from behind the canvas screens and, along with the Wrens, sit in a square of chairs around the room, just like you can see here. With his 10-foot wooden pole, Roberts would commentate on the preceding battle, blow by blow, a bit like a sports commentator delivering a post-match verdict. Roberts would draw attention to moments of particular brilliance, moments of particular disaster, and the turning points of each game. And these summations were, for Roberts, the most enjoyable aspect to the work. He relished the opportunity to create a picture of the battle much more vivid and engaging than the reports that were written by officers returning from earnest action at sea. As we listened to him, he made the most difficult situation appear simple, said Vice Admiral Gilbert Stevenson of Roberts' flair. He appreciated the difficulty that hundreds of commanding officers had in deciding what to do when faced with any of the surprises that war at sea constantly presented, and he taught them how to meet these surprises till they were ready for anything. Still, the combination of expertise and administration was not always welcomed by these experienced officers who were on the receiving end of advice from Wrens. Often the men would resent being told what to do, no matter how gently, by young women who were barely out of school and who, in many cases, had never even been to sea in peacetime, let alone during a war. During one 1942 game, Bob Winnie, who captained the destroyer HMS Wanderer, in which he sank 3 U-boats, handed his chit to one of the Wrens, Judy de Vivier, who was a particularly clued-up girl who he had been assigned. "No, sir," she said of Winnie's chosen move. "I do not think you should do that." Good God, he later recalled thinking of her firm and polite request. What on earth does this girl know about it? But so confident and tactful was de Vivier's tone that Winnie chose to hear her out. He listened to the Wren's convincing explanation in astonishment. From his perspective, a battle-worn captain was being tutored on the finer points of U-boat warfare by an inexperienced young woman. For Roberts, this exchange vindicated a long-held belief. With careful design, games have the capacity to make experts of amateurs and to instill in players invaluable, potentially life-saving, battle-winning experience. In the summer of 1942, escort ships sank 4 times as many U-boats as the previous month, beginning an upward trend that would continue broadly for the rest of the year. In the months that followed the development of Raspberry, using information gleaned via debriefs, Roberts and the Wrens developed numerous other tactical manoeuvres to suit the expanding variety of wolfpack attacks. Most of these manoeuvres, which involved the hunting of the escort ships performing different shapes and varieties of coordinated sweeps to find and hunt lurking U-boats, were given memorable names of fruit and vegetables such as pineapple, gooseberry, strawberry, artichoke, and a modification to the original maneuver known as a half raspberry. The unit revolutionized British anti-submarine warfare. By the summer of 1943, the U-boats had been decisively driven from the Atlantic. During the period that the Germans subsequently dubbed Black May, the German Navy lost 41 U-boats, many to Watu-coined operations. It was a decisive tally on this, the impersonal score sheet of war. Karl Denitz, who was by now the Grand Admiral of the German Navy, and who never lost his first love for U-boats or the young men who crewed them, ordered the withdrawal of the wolf packs from the Atlantic battlefield. It was, he urged, merely a temporary and partial change of operations. But 4 months later, the US Admiral Ernest King downgraded the U-boats to the category of problem rather than menace. In the 17 weeks that followed the 17th of May 1943, the Allies sailed 62 east and westbound convoys along the North Atlantic routes without losing a single ship to a U-boat. More than 12 million tons of food and supplies arrived unimpeded into Britain from eastbound convoys. Seizing the opportunity, senior officers at the Admiralty increased the size of convoys, which by June 1943 averaged no fewer than 62 merchant ships, compared to just 43 the previous month. The so-called tonnage war was finished, and with it, in most ways that mattered, the Battle of the Atlantic. Between the first week of February 1942 and the last of July 1945, when Watu officially closed, Close to 5,000 naval officers played the war game run by Captain Roberts and the Wrens during more than 130 courses. Graduates included the ornithologist and painter Peter Scott, remembered by one of the Watteau Wrens for drawing ducks all over his navigational chart, and a young Philip Mountbatten, future husband to Queen Elizabeth II, whose presence around the unit brought many of the Wrens unending delight, as one put it. There was also the writer Nicholas Montserrat, who would go on to describe in his 1951 novel The Cruel Sea a convoy game played out with model ships on the floor of an empty room that was clearly based on his experience with Watteau. In addition to the thousands of British naval officers who completed the course, Roberts and the Wren also trained delegates from everywhere from the United States to India, Malaya to Norway, and 4 university professors. Many graduates of the game credited the battles that they waged on the linoleum floor as instrumental in their subsequent victories during encounters with U-boats at sea. And similar tactical units sprang up across the British Empire, some of which were also staffed by young Wrens, who, by playing the game time and time again, slowly became experts in anti-submarine warfare. By 1945, a total of 66 Wrens had completed the course in order to become staff at Watteau or one of its sister units. 2,603 merchant ships and 175 of the escorting naval vessels were sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic, which was the longest continuous military campaign in the Second World War. More than 30,000 merchant seamen and more than 6,000 Royal Naval sailors died in the Atlantic during the war, many in attacks by U-boats. It was an astonishing loss of life that was tempered by the work of the men and women of Watteau and the sailors who deployed their tactics at sea. At the end of the war, on the closing down of Watteau, I wish to express my gratitude and high appreciation of the magnificent work of Captain Roberts and his staff, wrote Sir Max Horton, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. Their work contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany. Later, Churchill famously wrote that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Without Roberts and the Wren's work, the Battle of the Atlantic may have been lost, and perhaps the war with it. 4 weeks after the U-boats retreated from the Atlantic, my own grandfather, who was 17 years old at the time, made his inaugural journey across the ocean in a merchant ship which was protected by naval officers trained by Watteau. Thanks in major part to Watteau's work, he arrived in New York untouched. Many of those involved in Watteau's work never spoke of their role in the war. And while the group's feat and contribution has been barely remembered, by the time of the fall of Berlin in 1945, the U-boat commanders were intimately familiar with Roberts, his team, and their tactics. Roberts spoke fluent German, and he was one of the first British officers to land in Germany following Nazi surrender. He was, in fact, in Berlin the night the Americans performed their final bombing raid of the war. The following day, Roberts eagerly travelled to U-boat headquarters in the German town of Flensburg. There he met the veteran submarine commander, the architect of the Wolfpack tactic, and the man who later that week would become Hitler's successor as president of Germany, Admiral Karl Denitz. The men exchanged respectful salutes, but the other U-boat captains appeared to blanch at the sight of Roberts. Their fear was soon explained. As Roberts began his tour of the facility, he visited the U-boat operations room. There, enlarged and tacked to a wall, he saw his photograph taken from a magazine article, and beneath the image, a handwritten caption, "This is your enemy, Captain Roberts, Director of Anti-U-Boat Tactics." Games are usually dismissed as childish pursuits, something to be set down in adolescence and maybe picked up again in retirement. But as Major Tom explained to me in Shrivenham, in terms of great turmoil, war games rise in popularity and importance. That was true in 1942, and as office rooms in the Pentagon and Whitehall resound with the rattle of dice, it's equally true today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. That was dynamite. That was tremendous.
Oh, thank you.
If you have a question, there's a chat feature down below. Type it in there. You wrote in your book that when these naval officers first come to Watu and they have to spend their week there, almost without fail, they come in very cynical, very kind of raise their eyebrows, like, this is going to be a waste of my time. And yet, by the end of the week, they were almost to a man, they were totally turned 180 degrees.
Yes.
What was it about the game, about playing it, about the different tactics thrown at them that makes them such believers in how effective the game is?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is it's fair enough that they were sort of a bit fed up at having to do this because, of course, having navigated the gauntlet of the Atlantic and made it back to Liverpool safely, they were often very tired and wanted a week off, and then being told that they have to go and play games for a week was probably the last thing they wanted to do. So that was probably a contributing factor. I think there are a few things that would turn the attitude around. Firstly, Roberts was a very talented communicator. He actually, without the Navy knowing this, took some lessons on presentation skills during his time at Watu. There was a comedian, a very well-known comedian in Britain at the time, who was performing in Liverpool, and he took some night classes with him on how to hold the attention of people who were listening to his lectures. So is that he was very good at bringing these sort of battles on the floor, quite rudimentary looking, to life with the painting a picture of what was going on. But also, if you've ever played a game and lost, it's sort of irrefutable your failings, particularly if it's a strategic game. And initially, the officers would play their games without having the instruction, and they would perhaps lose their ships or at the end of the game see the fallacy of the decisions they had made, and realize that well, if that had happened just 4 days ago when I was in the middle of the Atlantic, then that could have happened to me. And then to have Roberts sort of patiently explain what they'd done wrong, what they might have done better, and to start going through Raspberry and the other tactics, probably felt like they were being given something of mortal weight and importance that they were going to hang on to. And then the chance to practice that through the crucible of the game was, of course, a way in which it would be shown the efficacy of the tactic would be shown. And this is really why war games are still used, and military training simulators are still very much a part of the military's arsenal in tactical and strategic understanding.
Were the young ladies involved in Watu that are the Wrens? They're not really allowed to talk about what it is that they do, right? So when does this become public knowledge, or they ever really publicly acknowledged, rewarded, credited?
Well, so I mentioned in the talk there that after the sort of late spring, early summer 1943, the U-boats really retreat from the Atlantic, and up until that point, it had been absolutely top secret. Nobody could talk about it at all. And that sort of loosens a bit as it becomes clear that the Battle of the Atlantic has turned in this way. And so Roberts is awarded the CBE, which is a recognition for his work given to him by the king at the time in early 1944. So that's really the first public recognition of him and his work, and he takes two of the Wrens with him along to the ceremony. and then because he's on this New Year's honors list, that some journalists are allowed to go and sit in and watch what's happening. And there's one journalist in particular who writes a bunch of different articles that go out in the early part of 1944. This is really the only press that's given to the work they're doing, and soon after the war, really, that work is forgotten, and certainly the Wrens are not allowed to talk about it. They're all bound by the Official Secrets Act for 50 years. Roberts, there's a biography written of Roberts in the late 1970s, which is really the first sort of time when he talks about what happens, but he gets some of the young Wrens' names are wrong in that book and spelt incorrectly. And so, yeah, it's really only in more recent years that the role of the Wrens, the instrumental role in really helping Roberts not only to uncover these tactics but supporting him in the training has come to light.
Do the German U-boat captains ever get together and try to counteract the new countermeasures, or did they just continue to do what it was they've been doing all along?
Yeah, this is a question that Roberts, so when Roberts gets to Flensburg, which is where the U-boat headquarters are, he has the sort of luxury of interviewing some senior members of the U-boat command there, including some U-boat captains themselves, and he asks one of them that exact question, and gets the answer back that they at some point they knew about Raspberry, that they heard about it, but at that point it was really too late for them. The sort of the Battle of the Atlantic, as pertains to U-boats and convoys, which was really from 1940 to the mid 1943, was sort of over from their perspective. So they didn't really take the time. But there were war games used on the German side as well. Yeah.
Did the British share this information with the Americans or the Russians, or was this totally top secret internal?
No, there was an eagerness to train Americans as well. Yes, so a number of, I can't remember the exact figures of how many American sailors went through the training, but of course the U-boat war sort of starts to touch the east coast of the States after the fall of France. This is because the U-boats can then move their sort of refueling stations to the west of France, and that increases their range. So they're now able to make it all the way over to New York and that stretch of coastline, and ships start getting sunk by the U-boats along there. So there was sharing of information, and also an eagerness, I think, on the Americans' part to absorb this information.
What made you write this book at this time, and are you working on something new now?
So it was, as mentioned in the talk, what really put me onto it was, what put me onto it was there were some Russian war games taking place a few years ago that were written about in the New York Times, and they were causing some sort of problems because they were taking place so close, I think, to the border with Ukraine, and so there was some stress about these war games. They were war games involving actual people running around in fields, and the Russians, in sort of coming up with this war game, had invented a whole nation that was their opponent in this war game, and had gone to the trouble of even making a Twitter account for this nation. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but that just got me thinking, oh, there must be someone who writes the fiction for these war games. That's quite interesting. That led me to do the wargaming piece for the New Yorker, sort of speaking to some of the people who write these scenarios. And it was during the reporting of that I first heard about Watteau and its work, which has really sort of come to light. There were a couple of war game designers here in Britain who had started to excavate the story and had written a paper about it, and that allowed me then to sort of do some of the work of tracking down the people involved, and managed to find Robert's stepdaughter who had all of his papers, and So yeah, sort of, that's the way these things often happen, a snowball effect, I guess. But yeah, it's timely as well, I think, probably because there's an interest in underappreciated roles, particularly, I suppose, of women in the Second World War, in all wars, but in the Second World War as well. And here is an example of where their role was really foundational in its impact and its importance. And so the attempt to sort of excavate as much of their stories as I could, at this point in time when one of the Wrens was still alive when I was first started reporting the book. I was able to speak to her, but she was very elderly and passed away during the reporting of the book. And so really then you're reliant on the stories that they've told their children. And so it's sort of piecing it together like that. As to your second question, I'm actually just sort of working on the finishing up a new book, which will be out probably in January, February time next year in the UK and in the US. And it's another wartime story, lesser known, sort of non-military, untold story, I suppose, or not untold, but lesser known story about non-combatants and heroism, which is all about internment in Britain, and a group of artists who fled Nazi Germany only to be interned on the Isle of Man under suspicion of being Nazi spies. And it's about their story.
That sounds good. In A Game of Birds and Wolves, you write about Roberts, you write about the Wrens, you also write about some of the U-boat captains, and as it's like several stories in one almost. As you're going through the different personalities and characters, was there one or two that you really liked, or one or two that you really didn't like? As the more you're writing about them, I'm like I this one really rubs me the wrong way. I really wish I would have known this person. Or was there a favorite or non-favorite for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Growing up, I suppose in Britain, and I'm sure this is true for in North America as well, that the films and the stories that you're past of the Second World War sort of are pretty black and white. That we were the Allies were the good guys, and the Axis power were the bad guys, and that's of course true in the absolute broadest sense. Reporting this book, what you have empathy, I suppose, for when you start looking at things from the granular scale of individuals. And the truth is that many of the young men who were on those U-boats were just recently out of school, weren't necessarily, certainly in the main were not Nazi Party members. They were just serving their country. And in fact, there was a distinction. If you watch the film Das Boot, which is a good example of a war film that shows things how they were, because it's based on a book written by a journalist who was on a U-boat. There's a very clear distinction on the vessel between Nazi Party supporters and seamen who view themselves with distance from that. They're fighting Britain and America and all the rest because that's their duty, rather than they necessarily believe with the politics. So that sort of swayed my own view of some of the captains. I think Kretschmer, who we saw in the talk, fell into the camp of he was not a staunch Nazi. He was he had a different view. He was one of three particular U-boat aces who the Nazis turned into celebrities, really. Truth be told, and Kretschmer resisted that at every opportunity. He just wanted to get on with things, and serve on his boat, and he was mostly concerned about the welfare of his own men. Gunther Prien was one of the other trio, and he was certainly far more politically in line with Nazi ideology. You sort of you'd take against him in a different way, I suppose. And the third U-boat ace was Joachim Speck. I think I'm probably saying that wrong for any German speakers, and he was much more of a sort of playboy captain who spent all of his time off the U-boat, cavorting with women in Paris and getting drunk on stolen champagne. So yeah, they start to really take on characters of their own, aside from that sort of, I suppose, younger view that I had as a child of just all Nazis are the same, when of course that's just not true, in the same way that not all Allied soldiers were the same.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been great. I loved reading this book. It was, and I love the way that you did break it into several mini stories in one. So I recommend this book highly. Thank you for taking the time today. This book was great. It's now in paperback. It's called A Game of Birds and Wolves. His name is Simon Parkin. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been tremendous. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe, and hope to see you again. And I look forward when the new book comes out. If you want to do this again, I'm all in.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you. That would be great.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And have a good day.